Good morning, and welcome to the Vermont Climate Assessment. We're very excited to have all of you here today, really a wonderful turnout. I'm Jillian Galford, the lead author of the Vermont Climate Assessment. And the Vermont Climate Assessment is the first of its kind. It's followed the model of the National Climate Assessment, which was released last month. And we are a partner of the National Climate Assessment through their NACA-NET, working on communicating climate change and its impacts across the United States. This is the first state-level report to focus on climate change impacts within a state, within Vermont. We're not just looking at policies, have we met our targets for greenhouse gas emissions, but we're looking at real changes that are happening in Vermont and its impacts on really important economically, socially, environmentally important sectors of Vermont and Vermont's identity. This project was conducted in the Gund Institute for Ecological Economics, and it was conducted by a group of graduate students under my leadership, and they participated as a service and team learning project that was really made possible with our partnerships with a number of stakeholders. Later in this event, you will get to hear from some of our stakeholders sitting on my left. Earlier in the event, you'll hear from some of our authors sitting on my right. But before we get started, a few logistics. The full report went live about 5 minutes ago on vtclimate.org. And if you're someone who likes to tweet, I encourage you to use the hashtag #ActOnClimate today during this event. So the fact is, climate change is happening. We've heard this over and over again from the IPCC and the National Climate Assessment. They show us that humans are releasing heat-trapping gases such as CO2, and that global temperatures are increasing. A recent study found that 99.9% of scientists agree this is human-caused warming of the Earth's surface. Nationally, we see that climate change is happening across every region of the United States, with most regions finding the last decade the warmest on record. If we look out in the future at models produced by CMIP-5, we see that Vermont should expect by 2100 a warming of 4 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit. That's very large. However, if you're a Vermonter, you'll notice that on those maps, there isn't a whole lot of detail or resolution about what will happen within the state of Vermont. For example, these national level assessments can't predict things like road failures during Tropical Storm Irene, pictured here. As scientists, we probably will never be able to predict exactly where and when things will happen, like extreme precipitation or road failures. However, we can work to understand our vulnerabilities for the future and prepare so that when those extreme events come, the impacts are not catastrophic. Climate change will continue in Vermont, and the goal going forward should be for Vermonters to thrive and grow along with the climate change. For the Vermont Climate Assessment, we are working to further the understanding of exactly how climate has already changed in Vermont and how it will change into the future using Vermont-specific data and resources. And today's goal is to communicate this information with stakeholders, and that goes from citizens to state policymakers to even our US Senate. What can we do about these impacts on Vermonters? In Vermont, temperatures have already increased 1.3 degrees Fahrenheit since 1950. About half of that has occurred since 1990, and the most recent decade was the hottest on record. These are all trends we expect to continue and even accelerate into the future. Most notably, precipitation is increasing across Vermont. Since 1950, the annual average precipitation has increased by 6 inches each year. Half of that, so about 3 inches, has occurred since 1990. This is large and significant. So these numbers in bulk are very interesting, but when we start to look in detail, we find that these increases in precipitation are particularly accelerated in our high altitudes, in our mountain regions across Vermont. And throughout the report, which I encourage you to go online and read, you'll find that there's a lot of detail about how different parts of Vermont are being affected. So not just an average for the state, but for example, what we might expect in a mountainous area versus a lowland area. So we see clear evidence from local weather stations that give us a long-term history of climate change in Vermont. We also are blessed with a wealth of citizen scientists. There we go. This is Ray Allen, who you will hear from on our stakeholder panel. He unwittingly collected a record of climate change on his farm. Ray collects weather data for the National Weather Service as a cooperative observer. In his own copy of these daily records, he notes when his trees blossom. And when we look at this data, we see a very clear trend. So this is the blooming date, full bloom, for his Macintosh apples in South Hero, Vermont. And what we see since Ray started his records in the early 1970s is that the trees are starting to bloom about 7 days earlier than they were in the 1970s. So this is a real impact of climate change. At first I was excited. I said, oh, maybe this means the apples will get bigger, or they'll produce more apples, or there'll be new opportunities. But a farmer like Ray also points out that there's new risks, such as increased risk of infections for the apples that make them scarred and ugly. So by knowing that these changes are coming, a person like Ray might be able to prepare better to combat the negative effects of the climate change going forward. Another great story of citizen science is Joe's Pond Ice Out Contest, which actually garners national attention. On Joe's Pond, they set a cinder block tied to a rope, tied to a clock. When the ice melts in the winter, the cinder block plunges to the bottom and unplugs the clock, recording the exact time that the ice went out. And when we look at the record, we see also a very clear trend. It's very similar to what we see at Allen Home Farm, and that is that the ice is going out 7 days earlier than it was when their record started. However, their record started a decade later than they did in South Hero. They started in the 1980s. This is a site in West Danville. It's slightly more mountainous, so what we're seeing is an accelerated change in temperatures and warming over time. Joe's Pond is a great example of very thorough, methodical science that was meant for really prizes, supporting the local 4th of July fund, but has become a great record of changing climate. It's a compelling collective narrative that's actually sparked national interest, and I think Joe's Pond could be the face of climate change, just like Joe the plumber was for the American middle class. These are just 2 examples of local data in Vermont, and I hope going forward we'll be able to find more such records and build more stories of climate change observed in our backyards, our lakes, our rivers, and beyond. So many impacts of climate change in Vermont will be positive, such as a longer growing season, but we need to prepare for the risks that come along with it, such as heavy rainfall and risks to our infrastructure. Replacing every bridge in the state of Vermont is cost prohibitive, but the cost of inaction on climate change for Vermont outweighs the cost of being prepared. So going forward, we need to face uncertainty and vulnerabilities in our state and try and prepare for what changes in climate could bring. So our format going forward will be a panel on the scientific findings, less on the climate and more on the impacts of climate change for Vermont, followed by a stakeholders panel where folks will talk about climate change and how it impacts their particular area of interest, individually as a state agency or as a business. The full assessment, again, available online, you should go download it, covers climate change policy and community development within the state of Vermont, energy, agriculture, water resources, forests, health, transportation, education, tourism, and recreation. It's very comprehensive. I'm sure we've missed some things, but hopefully it's an evolving process. Please note that after these panels, we will have a few minutes for Q&A, so hold your questions. And next, I'd like to introduce our meteorologist in charge from the local regional Burlington office of the NOAA National Weather Service to talk about changes in climate we've seen here in Vermont. Andy Nash.
All right. Thank you, Jillian. Hopefully you can all hear me. This is a great turnout this morning. I'm glad everyone's here to listen to what the folks have found in their study here. Some really good stuff. What I'm going to do is just go over a few of the data, the observations that we have seen already. Now, the National Weather Service, we're not in the business of making the long-term climate projections, what's going to happen decades from now. Our job is more short-term, but we are the custodian for all the weather observations. So we've got a lot of volunteers across the state. Ray Allen, as was mentioned earlier, is one of our cooperative observers, and I need to note that we are awarding him tomorrow with the 45-year award. So he's been doing this volunteer weather observing for us for 45 years, which is among the longest right now of our current observers across the state. So very, very impressive. So with these observations that we have taken with the Weather Service and our predecessor agencies going back over 100 years, there's a lot of clear trends. So first, I want to we saw this earlier, this is the national trend in temperatures. So you see a lot of red on the map. That means in the last 20 years, there's been warming pretty much across the whole country. If we go to the next slide, that is the national trend in precipitation. Again, taken from observations from a lot of volunteers across the country, all the weather reports that we can get, and you can see the trend where green means more precipitation. So it's getting warmer and it's getting wetter across much of the country. With precipitation, there are some areas where it's actually getting drier, the southwest U.S. and the southeast. But we're concerned more with Vermont. So the next slide is a little zoom in on just for the northeast with what the trends have been in precipitation. And so the bars, the upward bars, mean more precipitation. Now, climate change, it's affecting the whole world, and it's a big thing to try to grasp. And so what I really like what they've done here today is to just focus in on Vermont. What can we do here locally? There's changes happening in Southeast Asia, but for us to kind of wrap our mind around it is pretty hard to do, being on the other side of the planet. So what we're going to do is just focus in on Vermont. So if we go to the next slide, this is the temperature trends going back, for over 100 years. And you can see that upward trend in the temperatures at a number of stations in Vermont. So it's not just Burlington. It's not just South Hero. It's really all of the observations that we have scattered around the state are showing the same trend. So how many of you, think back to January and February, we're just like, oh man, when will this winter ever end? You were already sick of it by February, right? And we had this feeling of, wow, this was just a really cold winter. Well, really it wasn't. Compare back to the records, the winter we had was really the equivalent of what was happening in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. It was a traditional, historic Vermont winter. By no means out of the ordinary, but however, because of the climate change, we have all grown accustomed in the last 10, 20 years to much warmer temperatures. This warming trend that we see in the temperatures is especially prevalent during the winter and at night as we go through the year. So if we go to the next slide, with the temperatures overall warming, what we're seeing is one effect of that is the growing season is getting longer. So on the top of this chart here, we've got a plot of how the time of year when we have our last freeze in the spring, and on the bottom is when we have our first freeze in the fall. So if you look at the dates, what we're seeing is the last freeze in the spring is happening earlier. The first freeze is also happening later, getting a longer growing season. And this is increasing by 2 to 3 days per decade. That's a pretty rapid rate, as we've already observed. If we go to the next slide, again, precipitation. Again, most of the country is seeing more precipitation. Here's the trends for Burlington, where it's been an upward trend over the past several decades, especially. The other thing to note on this, if you look over on the right-hand side, in the last 10 years or so, you see bigger spikes to where it's been a dry year followed by a really wet year. So those lines are getting more extreme. That is another signal of climate change. The variability from year to year can be much larger in a warmer climate, the way everything can work out. So we're not only seeing overall wetter, but when we get a dry year, it's even drier. It seems a little at odds to an overall wetter climate, but that's part of climate change. If we go to the next slide, this is another view of looking at precipitation. So this one, we're just looking at the number of days in Burlington where we've had an inch of rain or more. And you can see, as you look towards the most recent decade here, how that line starts to really ramp upwards. What this is saying is that we have more heavy rain days now than we used to. Now, the problem with heavy rain is, the infrastructure may not be able to handle all of that. We get more flooding. And in fact, as we look back at the last 15, 20 years since the year 2000, in the state of Vermont, there have been 20 declarations, federal declarations for disasters. So it's 20 in 14 years. And just in the last 4 years, there have been 9 declarations. And 80% of these have to do with flooding. So we're seeing more days per year of heavy rain. That's leading to flooding. So, think back, even earlier this year, we had, with all the snow melting at the same time, we had some heavy rain, we had flooding that caused damage. Last spring, those of you who may especially live out along the Green Mountains in Underhill, significant flash flooding. 2011, we all remember Irene that were around here, but in the spring, massive river flooding, again from major spring melt, and heavy rain all happening at the same time. So if we go to the next slide, another example that we look at, or we can track in our observations that we are taking, is looking at how is Lake Champlain doing with the ice. So this is the long-term record that we have. It's actually a mishmash of lots of different observations and ways to designate whether the lake was frozen over. So going far back in time, we're not so sure what frozen really meant. Was it just the waterfront and the main lake was free of ice? We don't know, but I want you to focus in at the bottom of the chart. There are those little dots. The little dots mean that basically the lake was not considered frozen over or iced over. And you can see a lot more dots now versus previous decades. So in other words, we're not getting the ice as much, as frequently on the lake as we used to. So those of you, this past winter, again, wow, the lake is all frozen over. This is really, really crazy, and extreme. If we were to go back 50 years, 60, 70 years, it would have been a normal winter. It wouldn't have been this interesting little thing. But because we are seeing the warmer temperatures, warmer climate, what used to be the normal is now an out of the normal type of experience. So all of these data, these charts, and there are more that are in the report, the group used from the National Weather Service a lot of the data to just set that, where are we? The climate modelers that do all the projections, they match their climate models to the observations first and then project forward. So all these models that they're running are matched against these observations, and then that provides a level of confidence that the projections going forward are accurate. So, you know, the bottom line is climate change is here. It's happening. We are witnessing it. And this is just, you know, the start of how things are going to be. And so with that, I am going to, I think, pass it back to Jillian for the rest of the program. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andy. And now we'll go to our science authors panel. So all of the speakers on this panel are graduate students who participated in writing this report with the support of many, many stakeholders, lots of outside review, both from people at UVM and well beyond the walls of the university. So I will let them introduce themselves, say a bit about their findings from the chapters they authored, and then we'll have time for just a few Q&As that are more general to the panel before we go to the next panel, and we'll have more open questions at the very end. We will be passing out some note cards for your general questions for the panel, so if there's something you want, please put that on a note card that we're passing around. Thanks.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming. My name is Kristen Underwood. I'm a professional geologist and also currently a PhD student in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering here at UVM. And I authored the water chapter of our Vermont Climate Assessment. This chapter discusses the likely and the potential impacts to our natural and our built systems as a result of climate-induced changes to the water balance. Also presented are opportunities to build greater resilience in the face of climate change. We Vermonters have enjoyed relatively clean and abundant water, more than 24,000 miles of rivers and streams and over 800 lakes and ponds provide drinking water and opportunities for recreation, including fishing, kayaking, swimming. More than 290,000 acres of wetlands provide important wildlife habitat, serve as sponges to soak up and attenuate floodwaters, and recharge our groundwater reserves. Since we're a relatively rural state, nearly 3/4 of our population relies on groundwater for their drinking water supply. Changing rainfall, runoff, and temperature patterns will affect the availability as well as the reliability of our water resources in complex ways. As average annual rainfall has increased in recent decades, we know and we have observed that average annual flows in our Vermont rivers have also increased. Based on climate model projections, calibrated to the historic data, we know that with increasing precipitation, we can expect annual stream flows will continue to increase in the future. High flows are larger in magnitude and are occurring more frequently. For example, the graph behind me presents the number of high flow events in the Mad River watershed at Moortown for the existing record of that U.S. Geological Survey gauge, which dates back to 1927. From the trend line, we can see that over these 85 years, this watershed has seen, on average, 10 more days per year of high flow conditions, an increase from approximately 30 per year to 40 per year. By the end of the century, up to an 80% increase in the probability of high flows is projected under assumptions of high greenhouse gas emissions. These changes will lead to more inundation and erosion flooding, having implications for both our natural environments and our built systems. We can expect more damage to our roads and to communities that are established along riverbanks and shorelines, such as we experienced in Tropical Storm Irene or the floods of April and May 2011. Under current land use practices, we can expect more crop losses from inundation and erosion flooding on our agricultural lands. And we can expect more water quality impacts to our receiving waters from sediment and nutrient inputs. Over 1,000 miles of Vermont rivers are presently impaired or stressed as a result of sediment impacts, for example. And we could expect more and increasing turbidity and the likelihood for algal blooms associated with nutrient loading in that sediment load. Plymouth, for example, in central Vermont, is located along an in-stream chain of lakes on the Black River, including Amherst Lake, Echo Lake, Lake Rescue, and Lake Pauline. those lakes remained muddy for several weeks, really months, following Tropical Storm Irene. Accumulating sediment in those lakes is interfering with navigation channels and leading to an increase in aquatic plant growth. These are significant challenges for our communities, but I believe Vermonters are up to the challenge and are already responding to the challenges of climate change. With leadership from Vermont Agency of Natural Resources and VTrans, for example, we have built back our road systems following Tropical Storm Irene in ways that are much more resilient to flooding. In my hometown of Bristol, we've recently set aside over 300 acres of floodplain forest and riverside lands to attenuate flood flows in future events, thereby protecting the village of Bristol. So I do believe we're up for some challenges, but I also believe that we have the tools in hand to meet those challenges. And with that, I'll stop and turn it over to Sam.
Thank you, Kristen. Good morning. My name is Sam Carlson. I'm a master's student here at UVM's Rubenstein School for Environment and Natural Resources, and just completed my certificate in Ecological Economics at the Gund Institute here at UVM. I was the lead author on two chapters, the Recreation and Tourism chapter, as well as the Education and Outreach chapter. I'm just going to talk today about the Recreation and Tourism conclusions. Overall, I think it's a fairly positive outlook for Vermont recreation and tourism opportunities in the industry. That was frankly a surprising finding for me. Because our recreation and tourism is so seasonal in nature, I'm just going to quickly review each season and where we see things going over the next 40 or 50 years. Many of us live here in Vermont because we love winter, so I'm going to start with winter. And I believe that we may be in what we're calling a climate change sweet spot for winter in terms of snowfall. As Andy mentioned earlier, precipitation is increasing while the average mean temperatures during the winter are still remaining below the freezing point. So that means that more precipitation is going to mean more snowfall, particularly in the mountain areas. And that's good for the ski industry. Now, over time, 40 years from now, more of that precipitation is going to fall as rain, and that's obviously going to reduce the snowpack. Snow will melt more quickly. That's going to threaten the recreation tourism industries, whether it's for skiing or snowmobiling or ice fishing or what have you. Now, what we don't know is, going back to this climate change sweet spot, is how people will actually behave. And people in the Boston and New York metro areas, if they don't have snow outside their own back door, will they come up to go skiing? Will they come up to go snowmobiling? We don't know that. That's more a question of human psychology than it is science. But I think over the next 25, 30 years, winter actually looks pretty good for Vermont's tourism and recreation industry. With regards to summer, it's going to be a longer season. It's going to start earlier and end later. That'll draw more visitors, particularly those who are coming from the more oppressive heat that people down further south will be experiencing. And so that's good for Vermont. Less good is the fact that we'll have more pests, we'll have more mosquitoes, we'll probably have more ticks. That's going to require more monitoring and more attention to that issue. We'll also have more severe summer thunderstorms, which will dampen visitors' experiences. But overall, I think the outlook is positive for the summertime. The fall also looks good. It'll be a longer fall foliage season as leaves stay on the trees longer with warmer temperatures. The sugar maples that we love to see may fade out over time. They're likely to be replaced by the red maples, and so that the bright colors should remain. So the warmer temperatures in the fall may bring us more visitors through that fall season. So I think that's also good for Vermont's tourism and recreation. Looking at spring, well, we call it mud season, and mud season's likely to get muddy. It's not a particularly popular season for tourism and recreation, and it's likely to remain that way. And I will end there and turn it over to Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Palchek, and I'm a PhD student at the Rubenstein School of Natural Resources and also part of the Gund Institute. I authored the chapter on energy, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we're concerned about in terms of energy infrastructure, but then I hope to offer some reasons for hope and things that we can do. Everyone here is familiar with Hurricane Irene, right? That affected approaching 1 in 10 residents who lost their power during that event. We're going to see probably more events like that, more extreme weather events. We'll see increased lightning events, which will affect our energy infrastructure. It'll affect transmission lines and energy sources. So there are some concerns there. Fortunately, we live in a state that has been thinking about this, and we have an aggressive, comprehensive energy plan that has taken into account a lot of these trends and is working hard with some very ambitious goals to get us to 90% renewable energy by 2050. This will also include a need to reduce energy use. So we need to increase our ability to be more efficient with the energy we're using. And I'm going to talk about some ideas that might get us there. Efforts to insulate homes in Vermont right now are falling short, and this is part of the comprehensive energy plan. So how do we make this happen? I'm gonna loop back to this at the end of my talk here. I'll cover 3 ideas here that have implications for policymakers, people who are making laws, and the potential to move the dial on renewable energy. So the first one is information feedback. We know that when people have information about how they're using energy use, and particularly when that information is real time and current, they'll make changes. We know that. There's been a lot of research on it. They'll make changes that cuts up to 15 to 20% of their energy use. So there are these amazing technological approaches that look somewhat like an iPad called in-home energy devices. And you can set it on your kitchen table and take a look at what's going on with your energy use in your home and make modifications, maybe go shut off a light or shut off the dryer and see the effect of that. This could have an effect on people's behavior, or it does. We know it does. So legislators could offer subsidies to help people purchase these devices, and we could lower energy use in Vermont. Particularly with the arrival of the smart grid in Vermont, this could be a really powerful tool. Another thing we know that works is leveraging this idea of social norms. So we know that people care about what other people think and what other people are doing. And so we know that when we give people information about what their neighbors are doing in terms of energy use, they'll make changes. The O-Power program is a very cool energy conservation program that's in place in a lot of places across the country, in which you get your energy bill and you can see what your neighbors are using in terms of energy. If you're doing a good job, you get a smiley face. If you're doing a really good job, you get 2 smiley faces. And it turns out that this affects people's behavior, and they'll reduce their energy use if they know that their neighbors are reducing their own energy use. So we can play with some of these behavioral insights. Currently, Burlington Electric isn't using the O-Power program, nor is Green Mountain Power. When I spoke to a representative from Green Mountain Power, they said that they're very interested in this and they know about it. So this is a good opportunity that we can grab now, and is sort of low-hanging fruit to help us move towards these energy goals. And finally, I'll leave you with an interesting story from Britain. At the beginning of my talk, I mentioned that one of the goals in Vermont is to get more people to insulate their attics, right? Increases efficiency, we can cut down on energy use. We're not getting there right now. Well, David Cameron's cabinet was in the same situation. They were trying to get people to insulate their attics and kind of banging their heads against the wall, trying to figure out, they were offering subsidies and they were offering coupons and just couldn't quite get there. And then somebody who had studied behavioral sciences said, I was looking at a picture of an attic recently, and actually they're really messy. Maybe people don't want to deal with the mess. And it turned out that bingo, that was the answer. So these insulation projects also offered an attic clearing service, and home insulations went up significantly. So there's an opportunity for us too. So by using these creative approaches, we may be able to get energy efficiency. We may be able to move the dial on energy efficiency and energy conservation. And so I think we need a renewed commitment to tackling climate change, right? We all know that. It's happening in Vermont. It's going to continue to happen. We can apply behavioral insights to energy challenges, and I think really help Vermont lead the nation in addressing this extraordinary challenge. Thanks.
Thank you, Elizabeth. My name is Julie Nash. I'm a PhD candidate at UVM in natural resources, and I'm focused on ecological economics. As Jillian spoke to earlier, crop and livestock producers in Vermont are already facing opportunities and challenges from climate change. As the Vermont growing season graph above me highlights, many local producers are experiencing longer growing seasons. And it's fantastic that we have Ray Allen here to be able to provide a firsthand account of these changes. And the climate change models project that Vermont's frost-free growing period will extend as much as 1 month by the end of the century. This longer growing season provides an opportunity to be able to increase overall crop productivity and plant new crops, such as grapes and peaches. But climate change also poses agricultural challenges. As discussed earlier, there's a projection that there'll be a higher incidence of extreme weather events. These extreme weather events can result in damage to agriculturally related infrastructure and crop losses due to diseases and soil compaction. Climate models also project variances in patterns and the amounts of seasonal precipitation and temperature, as Andy spoke to earlier. In the spring, we have all seen the flooded fields, and this excessive soil moisture level can result in farmers delaying their spring planting. Temperature variations lead to early bud burst and bloom of perennial plants. In the summer, climate models project more short and medium-term dry spells for the region. These dry spells will be occurring at a time when crop water requirements are also increasing due to warmer temperatures. For Vermont livestock operators, summer heat stress could lead to decrease in livestock productivity. But most pronounced operational impacts come from increased feed and operating costs. Climate change impacts on these indirect costs make the industry vulnerable. To add to this, Vermont small businesses are particularly vulnerable to climate change. A single extreme event in a specific location can cripple a small business. With limited financial reserves, this yearly boom or bust cycling that can happen due to climate change can increase small business risk and vulnerability. But some greenhouse gas emissions stem from agricultural management choices. So agricultural producers can play an active role in decreasing emissions. Given the upcoming climate challenges, it is essential that Vermont agricultural enterprises develop forward-looking adaptation plans. And now I'll pass it on to Anne.
Thank you, Julie. I'm Anne Hogenboom, and I received my master's in public administration at UVM and was a Gund graduate fellow. I authored the chapters on climate change policy and community development. When we talk about the steady increases in temperature and precipitation levels, as Andy was presenting to you earlier, we see that these trends are driving real change right now in Vermont. As my colleague spoke about the damages from localized flooding events on crops and farmland, and the long-term declining projections for snowpack that threaten winter recreation, we see that both our livelihoods and quality of life in Vermont are at risk. To lessen the impact of these risks, it will require broad policy at the state level that will help protect Vermonters. Already we have set the stage with some pretty progressive policy action around mitigation. The group net metering law, for example, is supporting great breakthroughs in solar energy and allows Vermonters to generate their own electricity. Another example is Vermont's participation in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is a market-based regulatory program that's aimed to reduce overall greenhouse gas emissions. Vermont's membership in this initiative, in 2012, the result of this membership was that the state received $750,000 to reinvest back towards energy efficiency programs. The increase in heavy rainfall and extreme storm events that lead to flooding make Vermont communities extremely vulnerable. With our rural geography and the location of many of our downtowns at the base of mountainous river valleys, this has exacerbated the risk to flooding and will continue to be a serious risk as we look into the future. The town that I grew up in, Moortown, during Irene, for example, the entire town was under 8 feet of water. Our schools, our businesses, our homes, and our people are at risk across the state. In 2011 alone, every single county in the state of Vermont announced a FEMA disaster declaration in response to flooding events. So policy at the state level is crucial, but it must be paired with groundwork at the community level. This report details some of the existing work around the state and the opportunities that we have. For example, the Agency of Natural Resources, in response to legislation passed last summer, has been working with towns across the state to identify strategies for building resilience to future flooding through town plans. To date, 9 out of every 10 towns in the state of Vermont participates in the National Flood Insurance Program, and over 40 towns have adopted new regulations that protect corridors and floodplains. This work will continue to be needed to be looked at through a regional perspective and following the boundaries of watersheds. Another great example is the Vermont Planners Association. Over 150 professionals, landscape architects, engineers, and planning consultants from all over the state have come together to create a collaborative working group. This group engages with towns to promote climate resilience planning at a regional level. This report illustrates many other opportunities for building resilient communities and points to the process that will require a working relationship between these top-down policies and bottom-up community solutions. Responding to climate change is a very big challenge, but I do believe that we've started down the correct path and that we now just need to commit to that path. Thank you.
Thank you to all those speakers. In the interest of time, I'm going to hold the Q&A until our final panel gets to speak, so we'll have more open time then. And I'm pleased to present our stakeholder panel. I'll let you guys introduce yourselves. Thank you so much.
So hi, everybody. I'm Deb Markowitz, the Secretary of Vermont's Agency of Natural Resources. And I have a longer statement as part of the climate assessment. I was very honored to be asked to write a foreword, which really frames this assessment in our agency context, which is that we are at a time of uncertainty. And as the agency, we play a number of roles. One is obviously as environmental regulators. Another is as scientists, and in fact, many of our scientists partnered in developing the data that underlies this assessment. And we're also land managers. There's tens of thousands of acres of land in public ownership that our agency scientists have to build management plans over. And I really applaud this climate assessment effort because for the first time, we have in one place a lot of data, maybe not all of the data, but a lot of important information that can help guide policy. And if you think about it, we're right here in Chittenden County, which is the epicenter of the water quality debate right now as we're negotiating a new TMDL budget, which is a pollution budget with EPA relating to phosphorus loading of Lake Champlain. And one of the things that we've discovered is that a significant portion of phosphorus, almost a quarter of the phosphorus loading, is coming from stream bank erosion. That's the combination of the deluges that are occurring because of climate change and our historic channeling of our stream banks and their dislocation from their floodplain means that we're causing water pollution problems for the lake. So as we think about how relevant this information is, it applies everywhere. As we need to know what our rainfall is going to look like in the future, we need to know how it's going to impact our landscape so that we can use it to make our policies around managing the pollution to Lake Champlain, for example. As we think about land management, we manage a lot of forest. you know, basically the spine of the Green Mountains is very much in its conserved land or in state ownership or some in federal ownership. We've got these pests that are coming, the hemlock woolly adelgid we see. It's going to affect our hemlock forest, which is really the backbone of our forest, and the elm tree. The ash tree. We've got the emerald ash borer that's coming up this way. And so as we think about the future and how are we going to make our forests sustainable for the next generation, we need to have information. We need to have data to refer to that will help us make good choices into the future. So I want to applaud this effort, and I also want to note that there's a lot of action happening right now. You may have noticed that just a couple of weeks ago, the White House announced their National Climate Assessment, which is really a fabulous document, a fabulous piece of scientific work. It took many years, hundreds of scientists participated, but it doesn't dive down to the detail that we need to make decisions in our state. It has got a lot of good regional data. And I would suggest that the information, the data that's been collected that's as part of this project in an overlay with that National Climate Assessment will be very useful for us. As Vermonters and the Agency of Natural Resources, the Governor's Office, the Climate Cabinet, we're also engaged in some broader efforts. The Governor was appointed to the White House Task Force on Climate Preparedness and Resilience, which is a group that was convened by the President. It's of governors, mayors, and tribal leaders to provide him with recommendations of about how the federal agencies could better support state and local action to prepare for climate change. And one of the primary recommendations is that we need data. We need good information so that we could plan, so that we can make sure that as we're investing and building infrastructure or rebuilding infrastructure, we're doing it with climate resilience in mind. There's also a parallel regional effort. It's the Climate Leader Summit. We've been meeting for about a year, looking regionally at what we need to do to help our communities and our states prepare for the future changes related to climate impacts. And again, in that process, we've identified as a top priority getting good data. So I want to applaud this effort, and I also want to encourage UVM to consider making this an ongoing process, because as we know, the past is not precedent. We cannot look to history to tell us what we can expect in the future. As policymakers in state government, we need to act on good science and good data, whether it's in the regulatory frame, our land management frame, or as scientists ourselves. We need good data, and that means this really can't be a one-time thing. We need to have continued information so that we can have direction into the future. So I leave that to you, and I would welcome questions at the end.
Hi. Let me use that one. Hi, I'm David Blittersdorf. I'm a business person, and I'm the owner and CEO of All Earth Renewables. I've been in the wind and now the solar business for over 32 years, so back into the early 80s. But I'd just like to talk to you a little bit about the energy part of all this. Really, this report tells us where we are and what we've caused as a society to get to this point, and that's carbon and fossil fuels. And we've had wake-up calls for the last 40 years. The Arab oil embargo of the 70s was our first wake-up call that fossil fuels are finite, and then global warming is the result. We can't be using these sources in the future. But our problem is we've gotten used to this in our whole society. Industrial society over the last 200 years has built itself upon the millions of years of solar energy that we're burning up between 1900 and 2100. So we're at a change. And this report is really another wake-up call. And I think we should take it very, very seriously, that these are the results, and we can work on adapting and mitigating, but really we have to reduce carbon by probably 80% or more. That means fossil fuels have to be reduced by 80%. Our comprehensive energy plan goal of 90% renewables by 2050 is right on. Right now in Vermont, we're less than 12% renewables on our total energy goal. We're figuring that we have to do 20% renewables by 2020. We got 6 years to do that, and we're already behind. And why are we behind? Because we aren't paying attention and moving. We can sit here and say business as usual will work. I don't believe that. We need major change, and that means major policy change and a disruption. We need a revolution, not evolution. So we can feel good about, I drive a Prius, we all do our little things, but it's not going to move the needle. We need to do some major changes. And I believe out of all this, at the end of the day, we need to tax carbon at a very high level, $100 a ton or more, to actually get people to change. People don't change without hitting their pocketbook. And if we believe that they can change without hitting their pocketbook, I say good luck. It's not going to happen. So we must do a lot of things. And this state, where we are and who we are, we can. We're one of the smallest states, the smallest energy, and we have the resources to go to the 90% renewable target. But what are we going to do? We must electrify everything. We must double our electric supply. So we're not going to have less electricity available. We're going to have more because we have to heat and transport with electricity. And we must do major reductions in usage. 50+% reduction in usage. So not 10 or 20% weatherization, 50%. Those are the sorts of things that we have to do. So we have to line up policy to do that. And I'm going to throw out, as I end this, that the policy side is just an example. It takes us 2 to 10 times longer to permit solar or a wind project than it does to build it. So that's one of the problems. We must streamline permitting. We must accept that we're going to do massive amounts of solar and wind because those are the energy sources for our renewable system. We have hydro and a few other things, biomass. But those are the major things that are going to drive us. And we can do this in Vermont because we are small. And we can move faster than everyone else in the United States and the world, I think, because we are small. And we're all together on this. And I'm just going to end with one other big picture thing, and that is, as we electrify, I don't believe we're going to electrify the car. The car is one of our biggest problems. And we must get off of this idea that we're going to keep building roads, repairing roads, and doing these things. We must go to mass transit. We must go to relocalizing our energy, relocalizing our food systems, and where we live. And so we're going to live where we work. So in rural Vermont, the folks that live there are going to be the farmers or the loggers. We're not going to be driving all over the place anymore. And this is a major change. It hits us right here, and we don't want to see that. But these are where we're going to have to go. And at the end of the day, we're going to have a better life and a much happier place to live if we can do these things. But these are major changes that we have to do.
Hello, I'm Wynn Smith, the majority owner of Sugarbush and also the president of Sugarbush. And there are tons of things I could say, and I'd love to have a further discussion with David here because we'd probably agree on many things and probably disagree on many things as well, but that's what makes Vermont, I think. But one thing I certainly agree with David, and it affects us, is efficiency is absolutely key. I had a mother that died 18 years ago at 93, and I don't think she had a clue what climate change was, but every room she went into, she shut the lights off. And that was because she was a product of the Depression, was all about saving money and saving energy and living efficiently, if you will. The ski industry, I think, as an industry, is actually focused very much on climate change. The National Ski Area Association has something they call the Climate Challenge, of which we're a part, that asks ski areas to measure their global footprint and then really track how they're reducing the global footprint. Aspen in the West, for instance, has been a very outspoken advocate of energy efficiency and the need to reduce the carbon footprint, and there are many in the industry who believe that as well. If you look at sugarbush, the biggest impact that I have faced since owning the sugarbush actually isn't the lack of snow or rain in the winter, it was actually Irene. So what Irene did in August of 2011 is it flowed down before it got to Moortown. It took out our snowmaking pond. This had happened once before in 1993, but it happened in July. We had 60 days to put it back together in order to start making snow. Had we not been able to do that, we might have been out of business for the winter. I would say that the stream flow in the Mad River concerns me as much as anything. When it happens, how much it happens, and by the way, that was an uninsurable cost of about $1 million, so not insignificant. What the industry is doing, and we're doing at Sugarbush, is really, I think, focusing on something that we believe is good for climate change, but also is good for the sustainability of the business. And that comes to what David was saying, and that is using a lesser amount of energy. And I'll give you a good example. The old snowmaking equipment that you may have heard that sounded like a machine gun would sometimes use 400 to 500 cubic feet per minute per piece of equipment. Today, that technology has been reduced to the point where we've purchased equipment in the last couple of years that actually only uses 5 CFM or 5 cubic feet per minute. So if you can imagine what happens, the more water you can put out with the least amount of energy, not only is it using less energy, but it's saving a lot to the bottom line. So that's a real focus that we have made, and Energy Efficiency Vermont is actually helping us to accelerate that this year with a new program that they announced, which we are going to take full advantage of. David also mentioned something that we firmly believe with too, is auto emissions probably are one of the greatest villains in the world. Certainly we're faced with here in Vermont, but if you've ever been to Beijing, you've ever been to Mumbai, you know what auto emissions do, as well as the coal-fired furnaces over there. We've been very fortunate in Vermont to have the Green Mountain Transit Agency help to subsidize, along with the federal government, a transportation system we use in the winter. We're still, as Sugarbush, the major provider of, if you will, public transportation among our condos in the valley, but I think a lot more can be done there. It disappears March 31st. It doesn't exist in the summertime. That's a little bit of the chicken and the egg. You have to show the ridership to get the subsidy, but if you don't have the subsidy to have, you know, a predictable transportation system, how are you ever going to get the ridership? So I think that makes a lot of sense. I hope that electric cars do make sense. We'd actually like to begin to put in some, you know, electrical charging facilities at Sugarbush. And then, you know, somebody mentioned water quality as well. There's no question that, at least in my short tenure, that precipitation has increased. And I think one of the things we have to focus on is soil erosion, on stormwater treatment. We've done a lot of investment in that area. We're very pleased that we got the government's award for getting Ricebrook off the impaired stream a couple years ago, and that was really with anticipatory work that was done. So just in summary, I'd say that we're going to focus very, very heavily on energy efficiency, especially in what is the major area that we spend energy on, and that is in snowmaking in the wintertime.
Hi, I'm Ray Allen, a farmer. We live in the Lake Champlain Islands, which are just about, we're 12 air miles north of here. It has a unique climate due to the lake effect. Hailstorms are twice as apt to occur on the New York side of the lake as they are in the islands, and our hail insurance premiums were 50% of what they were in New York State. We have about the longest growing season most years in the state of Vermont due to the effect of the lake. We may have half again the length of growing season as they would have in the Northeast Kingdom, which means you can grow different crops. My family came to the islands in the 1780s, moved around a lot, settled the first settlers in Grand Isle. They went to North Huron, and part of them came to South Huron in 1870 on the farm I'm on. My great-grandfather and grandfather planted the first commercial apple orchard in Vermont that is still in business. My father took over in 1911 when he graduated from UVM. I bought the farm in '60 after I graduated from UVM. So he grew 49 crops. I'm currently doing my 54th crop of apples. I have a son and grandsons that are working with me on the farm, and I've got 2 great-granddaughters who are incredible little girls, and they love the farm animals and stuff that we use to help attract customers and to learn about farm animals. We have UVM groups from the college or School of Natural Resources come up every year, or have for quite a number of years. First question I ask them when we get down back, surrounded by apple trees and away from the highway, how many of you think global warming is a good thing? Last year I actually had one person that got the hand up about halfway and dropped it when they realized nobody else did. I think it can be a great thing. I'm very thankful for global warming, because 17,000 years ago, there's something like 2.5 to 3.5 miles of ice over this land. And then when the ice left, it had pushed the land mass 500 feet below sea level, so this was a huge inland sea. And it's been hard to grow apples under all that ice or under 500 feet of seawater. Do I think it's overdoing it? Absolutely. So I'm concerned about global warming, and we're adjusting. A year ago, had the worst apple crop. It's number 53 I've ever had. We had April and half of May. There was 2.5 inches of rain. Things were getting dry, but it was nice. You could drive anywhere in the orchard. In the next 6 weeks, we had 15 inches of rain. Now, one of the things we spray for the most is apple scab, which is a fungus disease over winters on leaves on the ground, and when they have a wetting period, they discharge up into the tree and establish these fungus growth on the leaves, and it spreads to the apples. Now, an inch of rain will take off most of the spray. 2 inches of rain we have to consider we're unprotected, which means spraying again, so that's a lot of spray. But meanwhile, on most of the land where it's heavier soils, it looked like there was accumulated water on the surface. And if you take a big tractor and a big sprayer and 500 gallons of water, you could drive into the orchard most anywhere, but you couldn't drive out. So we had weeks during primary scab season we could not spray. As a result, the scab just spread and virtually destroyed all the fancy apples. Federal crop insurance said it was 100% loss. When they get to 80%, they round it off to 100% loss. We'd planted 100 cherry trees. We're trying to diversify. Cherry trees don't like wet feet, and a third of the trees that we put in died as a result of that. We'll put some drainages and try that again. So the highest price we get for our apples, it's all in packaging and marketing, is I hand mix pie dough and roll it. My wife does the fillings, and we can take utility grade apples and wrap them. Instead of plastic bags, we wrap them in pie crust, and we get a lot more for those than we do any other apples. And you laugh, but it accounts for 10% of our gross income now. I got a good grip. And anyway, so we are diversifying. We're cutting back on the apples we grow because the wholesale markets have changed greatly. Between my father and I, we've seen a lot of changes. He was selling in barrels to people who came with horse and buggy. And now people go to the Hannaford and buy 2 apples when they stop in to get that night's supper, as opposed to buying large. So people love to come pick apples. So we advertise, pick your own. People get out in the orchard, they go with families, they have a great time right on a trail. So we're evolving very much, and we're cutting back, so we'll have less wholesale to worry about. We'll do more retail. We're diversifying into blueberries and raspberries and tart cherries. We've got a brewer who wants several thousand pounds of tart cherries every year. And they ripen in early July, where the apples come at the end of August. And if we get a hailstorm, 5 minutes can destroy our crop. So if that comes in August, at least we've gotten the cherry crop off and raspberries and stuff. So anyway, it's a challenge, it's real, and we're continuing to try to adapt.
I'm Doug Lonton. I'm the Dean of Extension here at the University of Vermont. Extension is the outreach arm of the University of Vermont. We're all over the state in local offices. We're 101 years old this year, and we've been working with communities and agriculture during that 100 years. And I can speak for all my faculty and staff that are spread across the state, the changes they've seen over the last 30 to 40 years. Because even though they didn't have the data necessarily as Ray and others did, they were working with working landscape entrepreneurs, farmers who looked for changes, knew where the best land was, could see climate change, began to look for new crops or new approaches to make sure they could mitigate their risks. So for us, in extension, this kind of assessment is a documentation of the change that faculty and staff in extension have been working with folks on the ground for many years. Dr. Vern Grubinger has been around for some 30 years, and he's down in Brattleboro, and he helped bring high tunnels into the state to extend seasons, but also to protect from hail and other insects and diseases. Dr. Heather Darby up in Alburg, the other end of the state, has been working a lot with hops and other crops for diversification that now can be grown in the state of Vermont and add to the diversification of income into farm enterprises. Ernesto Mendez in Plant and Soil Science Department here, Tom Volderman, the Dean of the College of Ag and Life Sciences, and I scraped up $300,000 so that we could do the Vermont Farm Resilience Participatory Research Program, where folks go out and talk with lots of farmers across the state to learn what they had been doing over the past number of years to adapt, to mitigate, to become more resilient against the climate change. And most recently, Dr. Joshua Faulkner, who is here from the Center for Sustainable Agriculture, was also hired to work specifically on climate change. And so UVM Extension, as being part of the university, and for the number of folks we have across the state, have seen these changes and understood that we had to also help bring education and outreach to communities through Vermont Energy, community forums, but also just in our agricultural production arena. On campus, we have something called the Food Systems Initiative, and I happen to be the director of that as well. And within that initiative, the University of Vermont clearly sees how we produce our food will be impacted by climate change as we go forward. And so this assessment, again, is a great foundation from which to continue that conversation and to move forward. And we'll have our third Food Systems Summit next week, where we don't just look at the production, and we don't just look at the politics, but we also look at the behavioral and cultural considerations that were mentioned down the table here by David. Because that behavior, our behavior, and our cultural considerations have to be taken into account if we are going to make changes going forward, whether that's around the kitchen table with a farmer, whether that's around a community forum, whether that's around a university. We all have to be looking for ways and understand ourselves and the way we react so that we can make changes going forward. And lastly, the university has always been a leader in environment, and the provost and the president have been working very hard over the last year or so about forming an institute for the environment here on campus, because even though we've always been a leadership in environment, we always haven't been in one single camp in that relationship. And so the Institute for the Environment will tie together the strengths of the Gund Institute, the Rubenstein School, Environmental Studies, Environmental Sciences, so we can even do a better job as a higher education institution in supporting Vermont and everything we're doing here to work on climate change related issues. And with that, I know I'm between you and questions, so I'm going to give the floor back to Jillian. Thanks.
Thank you so much to all our panelists. If you guys put questions on a note card, if you could hold it up and someone will come around and grab it from you. And if you didn't put it on a note card, hopefully we'll get to your question as well. While they're collecting those, I wanted to say something about the future directions of the Vermont Climate Assessment. This was an effort that we put together this year, and it's an effort that absolutely must continue. The way that looks going forward is an open question. I think there's a lot of room in Vermont to work on education, whether that's education of our policymakers or education in our K-12 schools. There's a lot of room to be improving our knowledge and preparing for climate change in Vermont. Each of you as citizens need to think about what your role is in preparing Vermont for climate change. The members of the media are here to help us communicate these stories and make Vermonters more aware about what's coming in the future. Just this morning, I got an email from the Air National Guard who would like to be briefed on the findings from this report as they prepare for emergency responses in Vermont going forward. I think from our panel, we also learned about how businesses are taking action. And Vermont is becoming a national leader, both from agencies within the state dealing and adapting with climate change, planning for the future, and in private business. So not only are we an example, but we're also creating a type of capital. We have leadership and technology that's being developed here and that we can export and help other states learn together. I hope going forward that we will be working with other partner states in their own climate assessment under the coordination and partnership with the National Climate Assessment. But certainly the way to make sure the Vermont Climate Assessment continues is for everyone here to demand that it continues, to constantly be seeking new information and helping us push this process forward, whether that's through communication with me as a student who may get involved in doing research, or as someone taking action on the ground as a stakeholder. So with that, I'll go to some questions. All right, we have a question on natural systems that I think maybe Deb would be good for, although anyone on the science panel can jump in. So how might we deal with climate refugees, such as from coastal areas? I'm sorry, they're talking about people who move in here. I was thinking about refugia in Vermont ecosystems. So you can answer that question.
I can answer it both ways if you like. It's something, you know, when we think about climate resilience in Vermont and public policy, the most important thing we could be doing is looking at our land use patterns and rethinking some of those policies and rules and regulations that govern land use. So when we're thinking about the possibility of climate refugees coming to Vermont, I think that's not unrealistic. In fact, after 9/11, there was a bump of folks moving to Vermont because they were worried about being in target cities. And so as we move forward, we need to think about a couple of things. One is we've got a traditional land use pattern where we build in our river valleys, which are really vulnerable areas, as we saw during Irene. That means, well, let me step back. So we also have a lot of open space still, our natural infrastructure, the natural protection, the place where the river could release its energy, and those are the areas most at risk, right? Because that's where, if you take a look at the history of sprawl, where we're getting, 7 new buildings, 1 new house, taking that natural infrastructure offline, essentially, for providing the ecological services that they could be providing to protect our built areas. So one place we need to be looking at regulation is how are we managing our floodplains. And for those of you who haven't really studied this, as we've built in our river valleys, it means that we've channelized our rivers. So as the water comes through those towns, it's going faster, and there needs to be a good place for it to release. And one way to do that is to make sure in those outer areas where we still have our floodplain that our rivers can connect to those floodplains so that it can flood in areas that aren't going to destroy infrastructure. So we need to figure out how to preserve that natural infrastructure. But the other, perhaps even more important area is forest fragmentation. So we're 80% forested in Vermont, but 85% of that land is in private ownership. And of that, the vast majority of owners are senior citizens. they're retired, there's going to be intergenerational transfers. And that puts at risk a lot of our unfragmented forest land. And if you think about it, it's, we saw on the slide here that the deluges are happening with more frequency the higher up you are, and that's our real flood protection, is our forests. And it also, answering the question both ways, is having unfragmented forests is one of the most important things we can do for refugia, to make sure that as there's changes in our ecosystems that our habitat can slowly shift, and that we can provide a welcome place for the plants and animals as they're stressed by climate change and ultimately move north or south depending on the species. So it's all about land use, and it's both the river valleys and our upland forests.
Thank you. So we have a number of questions about efficiency, so I may open that up to anyone who wants to address it. But first of all, these questions get at why do we need energy efficiency in Vermont? And one fact to know is that Vermont is almost neutral in terms of our emissions of greenhouse gases and our sequestration, our uptake, our sink of carbon. And that's because we have such a vast forest. We're the third most forested state after Maine and Alaska, I believe. And so the question is, why should we further reduce our emissions? And I think earlier we were speaking of Vermont as a leadership role, the fact that we can do better than the emissions we have now. We know we can reach those targets, so that's why we should decrease those. Elizabeth also alluded to the fact that our energy infrastructure is very vulnerable in the face of extreme climate events, and having a more localized energy system would help prevent disruptions to our system. And some of those disruptions aren't even within state. We're talking about hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico that can disrupt the supply of fossil fuels to Vermont. Elizabeth, or perhaps David, do you have any other comments on efficiency?
Well, maybe I'll, maybe I could take a first kind of big picture approach to that, and then turn it over to the other side of the table, because I think there were some useful things said earlier. But I think big picture, why should we use more energy than we need? Why not reduce our energy use? And part of that is because there are effects to the climate, right? We know when we use energy, there are greenhouse gas emissions, and that's affecting things and changing things. But there's also a really strong business case for efficiency. It costs less. So I referred to a study earlier that found that when people have information about how they're using energy, it reduced their energy use by 20%. That takes a $100 energy bill, which is close to what ours is in my home in the winter, and it reduces it by $20 a month. So that's, and that's a small scale. I live in a small place. So I think that there's lots of reasons to increase efficiency. One is kind of the moral issues related to climate change, but also because we can save money and we can make better use of those fuel sources.
To follow up on the efficiency, I'd like to add the word conservation. Conservation is you don't make something more energy efficient that you use, you just don't do it. So it's a change. But the biggest picture on efficiency is I'm in the renewable energy business, and renewable energies are the only sustainable energies that we have. The fossil fuels are going to be gone. They're one time. And there's a promise that solar and wind can do everything. It can't. We cannot, in this world, power what we're doing with the energy we need with renewables. We must do huge decreases in energy use on the order of 80%, so that the solar and wind and hydro can do what the rest. So, and just to put it in perspective, fossil energy is like winning the lottery. We got a one-time shot, and we're using it all up. And renewable energies are your weekly paycheck. and you can tell the difference between the two, that we have to live on the weekly paycheck and not on one-time lottery winnings, which we've been living on, but that's disappearing. So we must do massive amounts of conservation and efficiency.
Thank you. I think in the interest of time, we'll do one last question, and then you can all join us for refreshments and conversation. This question was how the assessment might feed into the GPI, which is the Genuine Progress Indicator, and is used in Vermont as an alternative measure of the economy and the health of our economy. It accounts for social and environmental welfare. So I'm going to turn that to Sam, who's actually a student who's worked with the GPI quite extensively.
Thanks, Jillian. First off, I would encourage whoever asked that question to follow up with Eric Zensi, who's over here as one of the lead authors of the Vermont Genuine Progress Indicator report, and he will give you more detailed information than I can. If I recollect correctly, how we were looking at the cost of climate change in Vermont's Genuine Progress Indicator, it was largely a function of the carbon emissions related to our economic progress. That is, we assigned, as David Blittersdorf referred to earlier, a carbon tax, a cost of carbon, and it was close to $100 per ton of carbon was what we were calculating as the social cost of those carbon emissions. So while fossil fuels and use of natural gas and gasoline and all that may be driving our GDP and our economic growth, what's not being taken into account are those carbon emissions that come from that. And so we were applying a social cost of carbon for every ton that was being pushed out into the atmosphere, and that brought down Vermont's Genuine Progress Indicator every single year, and increasingly so. It was one of the largest sort of downward dynamics to Vermont's Genuine Progress Indicator. But again, I'd refer you to Eric Zensi, who can talk a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Thanks. So let's have another round of applause, and thank you to our panelists.